Have you ever come home to the very house you built with your own sweat and tears, only to be stopped like an intruder? Have you ever reached the top, with everything in your hands, yet one prejudiced glance drags you straight to the bottom? That night, the air was still. Golden lights spilled across the stone-paved road leading to a gated community. Dorian Hayes, a black CEO returning from a long business trip, sat behind the wheel of his luxury car. But as he stopped at his own gate, a group of newly hired security guards stepped in front of his car. One of them approached, his voice laced with caution and a hint of disdain. "What are you doing here this late at night?" It sounded harmless, but for Dorian, it was a knife twisting an old wounds all those times he'd been treated like he didn't belong in the places he had spent his life fighting to enter. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was how the system worked, seeing his skin before seeing his humanity. But some people don't need to shout to show their power. Some wounds don't need revenge through violence, only a silence deep enough to make the world listen. And what they didn't know was that just 8 minutes later, the very man they had insulted would make the entire system bow to him. If you've ever felt that sting being looked down on in a place where you belong, leave a like, share this story, and follow the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss these moments where silent justice gets exposed. Because this isn't just a story, it's a reminder. Real power doesn't need to scream. It only needs to show up. And now, come with me into that night where everything that seemed ordinary became a lesson they will remember for the rest of their lives. That night, the air was still. The rows of maple trees along the road stood frozen, as if holding their breath before witnessing a moment this neighborhood had never seen. Dorian Hayes slowed his car, the tires gliding over the stone-paved road leading to the estate he owned, a place advertised as a sanctuary for the ultra-wealthy. His luxury car, worth as much as a downtown condo, rolled to a stop at the gate. He exhaled a long breath, shaking off the weight of his business trip. It was late. The golden streetlights stretched across his face, highlighting the lines of a man who had fought his way to the top. This was his house. This was the space he had paid millions to belong to. But what happened next shattered that feeling entirely. 2 young security guards stepped out of the booth, flashlights cutting through the windshield as if they were searching for a suspect. One of them tapped on the window, his voice cold and tinged with disdain. "It's late. No outsiders are allowed in this neighborhood." Dorian looked up. He didn't answer right away. To them, those words might have just been protocol, but to him, they were a knife twisting in an old wound. Outsider. He had heard that word his whole life. Even in the boardrooms of the world's largest corporations. Even when standing on stage accepting awards for exceptional leadership. The looks were always there, silently saying what no one would dare say out loud. "You don't belong here." A black man in spaces they believed weren't his. He lowered the window, offering a faint smile. "This is my home," he said, calm as if stating an obvious fact. But to them, his words carried no weight. One of the guards raised a brow, glancing at the car, then sizing up Dorian like a piece of suspicious luggage. "You're home. Funny. Never seen you around here." Dorian didn't reply right away. Instead, he studied them the way a young man in a cheap uniform could stand there, in front of someone who had climbed to the summit of power, and speak with the tone of a judge. It was almost poetic. The men paid to protect him, now treating him like a trespasser. He nodded slowly, then gave a small, measured smile. "Interesting," he said softly enough that they couldn't tell if it was a compliment or an insult. And in that moment, he knew one thing. In just a few minutes, these men who saw him as an outsider would learn exactly what it means to belong. They didn't yet realize that tonight, the very stranger they stopped would decide their future. The night air felt metallic against his skin. Streetlights glared against the wet cobblestones. remnants of an earlier reign. The surrounding mansions glowed in the distance not as a comfort, but as silent eyes watching, judging his every move. Dorian could feel it, the entire neighborhood silently observing a black man being put in his place. The guards stayed in position, one sweeping his flashlight repeatedly across Dorian's car as if searching for evidence. Their faces were young, brimming with the kind of confidence that came from holding a small, temporary power, the power to decide who was worthy of passing through this gate. One of them rested a hand on his hip, as if prepared to do more than just block the car. Dorian noticed. He always noticed. He'd learned to read this kind of body language, the unspoken message, "We don't trust you, and we can do whatever it takes." A memory surfaced. The first time he walked into the boardroom of a company he was about to acquire. He wore a tailored suit, a watch worth more than most annual salaries, and yet the looks told the same story. He doesn't belong here. They hadn't needed to say it, and tonight, the same look was staring back at him. Dorian's hand brushed the finely stitched leather of his steering wheel. This car was once a dream back when he was a boy on the other side of the gate, staring in at the people society called elite. Back then, he swore one day, "I'll be on the inside." But tonight, even in the car of his dreams, parked at the gate of his own home, he was treated like he was still outside. "This is a neighborhood for the upper class," one of the guards said, his tone almost mocking. "People like you don't usually show up here." Dorian chuckled, not because it was funny, but because the irony was too sharp to ignore. He had paid for this privilege, and yet the very people paid to protect him were denying his right to exist here. He looked them dead in the eyes, his faint smile never fading. "Maybe," he said slowly, "you'll be seeing me a lot more than you think." The words lingered in the air like a velvet-wrapped blade, and in Dorian's mind, a decision crystallized, one that would make this entire neighborhood remember this night. But they still didn't understand. They couldn't imagine that in just minutes, the roles of judge and judged would completely reverse. To them, he was nobody, an unimportant man, out of place in their exclusive neighborhood. The flashlight beams kept cutting across his face. Dorian didn't flinch. He just sat there, observing. One of the guards smirked, letting out a half-joking, half-deadly serious comment, "Not many black folks like you around here." The smile on Dorian's lips paused, not because he hadn't heard it before, but because it came here, of all places, a place he had paid more than anyone to belong to. That single remark dragged him back to 1,000 silent judgments, hundreds of dinners where he was the guest who didn't quite fit, and countless meetings where his achievements could never outshine his skin. He turned his head toward the guard who'd spoken. The smile returned sharper now, like a blade. "Really," he said, lightly, almost conversationally, but there was something in his tone that made both guards instinctively step back. Dorian lowered his hand, picked up his phone, and scrolled to a familiar contact. He dialed, calmly, no rush, no explanation. "Come to the estate gate," he said into the phone. "Now!" He hung up and set the phone aside. Time slowed. The air so quiet he could hear the wind slipping through the trees, and the heavy breathing of the men who had just insulted him. For Dorian, the next 8 minutes weren't about waiting. They were about letting them sit in their shallow pool of arrogance, unaware that the tide was about to turn. One of the guards cleared his throat, trying to sound confident. "Your friends don't waste our time. Guys like you don't have anyone who'll get here in time." Dorian didn't answer. He leaned back, closed his eyes, like a man enjoying a quiet song. And deep down, he knew in just a few minutes, these men would face a reality they couldn't imagine when they threw those words at him. They didn't know that the man they were mocking wasn't just some guest. He was the one with the power, the man this entire neighborhood would remember after tonight. Dorian opened the glove compartment and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He removed his driver's license and the official residency card for the estate, the kind no legal homeowner here could be without, holding them between two fingers. He extended them toward the young guard at his window. "Here," Dorian said evenly. "Perhaps this will help put you at ease." The guard took the cards, glanced at them for barely a second, then tossed them back through the window like they were worthless receipts. "Anyone can fake an ID," he said with a dismissive shrug. His tone wasn't an observation, it was a sentence. Dorian didn't flinch. He simply stared at the discarded cards lying on the passenger seat. His expression was calm, but deep inside, old memories stirred. He remembered his early career standing in line at luxury hotel check-ins, questioned like a thief trying to pass off a stolen credit card. He remembered driving up to exclusive golf clubs, only to be told to wait for verification while others breezed in with nothing but a nod. Those moments, buried under years of success, still clung to him like stubborn dust that never washes away. The streetlight's glow cast deep shadows across his face, outlining the quiet resilience in his eyes. He didn't get angry. He didn't need to. A man who had spent his entire life proving his worth had long since learned that some battles aren't worth the breath. He let silence answer for him, a silence so deliberate it turned the air heavy. But the guards mistook his restraint for weakness. One of them smirked, leaning toward his coworker just enough to make sure Dorian heard typical. "Think driving a fancy car gets them through any gate." Dorian leaned back in his seat, eyes closed, not as an escape, but as if to insulate himself from their noise. In reality, he was counting seconds. Each passing moment brought him closer to the instant when everything would flip, when truth would cut through the cold. Shallow arrogance these men were so comfortable wearing. They didn't know it yet. Every second they judged him. They were walking closer to the edge. And it wasn't the chill of the night air that bit into his skin, it was the familiar, crawling cold of someone else's judgment. Dorian sat in his luxury car on buttery leather worth more than most cars on this street, and yet felt himself transported back in time. Back to when every inch of ground he stood on seemed to whisper, "You don't belong here." He remembered being that little boy in the projects, surrounded by the stench of trash and oil smoke. He remembered standing outside the chain-link fence of a public playground, watching the clean, laughing kids on the other side. The guard who came out said nothing, just waved him away like he was shooing off a stray cat. That sting, that humiliation, he thought he'd left it behind, but it had never really left him. Dorian had grown up with one mission to walk through every door that had ever slammed in his face. He studied until exhaustion blurred the lines of his days. He worked until sleep became a luxury. He endured hundreds of skeptical handshakes and hollow promises just to earn a seat at the table they said he'd never reach. Now, he sat at the top, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar company, owner of a home that turned heads. And yet, the feeling of being a guest in someone else's world still clung to him like a shadow. He stared at the black iron gate ahead, towering, ornate, European in design, a symbol of power, a symbol of privilege. Power he had bought, privilege he had bled for. And yet, with those two guards standing there, arms crossed, scrutinizing him like a trespasser, it didn't feel like home. It felt like he was back outside the fence. Dorian let out a quiet, bitter laugh. Life had a cruel sense of humor. He once dreamed of this very moment driving into a neighborhood like this, being greeted by guards with respect, with recognition. But in the reality, the very people paid to protect him were lifting their chins and telling him he didn't belong. He gripped the steering wheel gently, not from rage, but to remind himself why he'd fought so hard to be here. Not for their approval. Not for their acknowledgement. And certainly not to argue with men who thought a uniform gave them the right to define him. They thought he was an outsider in their world. What they didn't know was this world ran on his power. Dorian opened his eyes, locking them on the guards. He'd met all kinds of people, real power players and those who only pretended. These two weren't either. They were boys in costumes, clinging to the illusion of authority stitched into their cheap uniforms. He reached down, picked up his ID card from the seat, wiped it clean with his thumb, and set it back in place. Then he looked up and smiled, not warmly, but with the kind of polite precision that hid a blade behind it. "Interesting," he said lightly, almost as if critiquing a mediocre performance. "Go on." The words made both guards freeze for just a moment. They didn't know if he was agreeing or daring them to keep digging their hole deeper. But one thing was clear: the air had shifted. His tone wasn't submissive. It was expectant. One of the guards straightened, forcing a crooked grin. "We'll need to verify further," he said, clinging to his false sense of control. "You know, not everyone gets in here." Dorian nodded, like he found the remark amusing. "Of course," he replied, his eyes drifting past them toward the long stretch of glowing road behind. "Do what you need to do." He folded his hands over his stomach and sank back into the seat. In the dim light, he didn't look like a man denied entry to his home. He looked like someone watching a bad play knowing full well the ending belonged to him. Time stretched. The ticking of his watch grew louder in his ears, each beat marking their march toward the inevitable. But Dorian didn't rush them. He let them live in their illusion of control. Because when he said "go on," it wasn't permission. It was an invitation for them to dig their graves a little deeper. And in just a few minutes, they'd realize the man sitting quietly in that car wasn't the one being judged. He was the one preparing to judge them. Dorian leaned over and opened the center console, retrieving his phone with deliberate slowness. No rush, no drama, as if he were just another man making another call. The two guards stayed where they were, one with his arms crossed, the other leaning casually against the gatepost, eyes fixed on him with that mix of wariness and quiet disdain. Dorian didn't bother looking back at them. His finger scrolled through his contacts until it landed on a familiar number. He pressed it, brought the phone to his ear, and waited for exactly one ring before speaking low, steady, unshaken. "Come to the estate gate, 8 minutes." No explanation, no small talk, just 8 words. He ended the call, placed the phone on the passenger seat, and leaned back as if nothing had happened. His face gave away nothing. The guards glanced at each other. That call didn't sound like a bluff. Someone who could give an order like that, at this hour, wasn't some random man trying to sneak into a gated community. But they stood their ground, holding on to the story they'd written in their heads. This was just a man trying to prove something. Dorian settled into his seat, eyes half closed, but he wasn't resting. He was listening. To the hiss of the wind moving through the trees. To the faint hum of insects in the night. To the nervous scuff of a shoe dragging across stone, one of the guards shifting his weight, unable to stand still under the weight of this silence. Time began to stretch like taffy. 8 minutes. For them, it was just waiting. For Dorian, it was a rope tightening around their necks. One of the guards spoke, trying to pierce the heavy air. "Friends," he asked, smirking to mask his unease. "Or family. Whoever you called, it won't change the fact you're not getting through." Dorian didn't answer. His silence was a mirror, reflecting back the pettiness of their words. No debate, no argument. He'd lived long enough to know that sometimes silence is the sharpest reply. The air thickened. The older guard cleared his throat, a small, pointless sound meant to fill the void that was swallowing their confidence. Dorian opened his eyes and fixed them on the towering black gate. He knew what he was doing. He knew that in exactly 8 minutes, everything would shift. And they didn't realize it yet, but the wheels of power were already turning. And when they turned, they crushed everything in their path. The second hand on Dorian's watch ticked deliberately. each movement dragging the moment out. 8 minutes. A meaningless sliver of time on any other day. But here, in this silent standoff, it stretched into a lifetime. Long enough for a man to master his breathing. Long enough for two boys in uniform to feel the weight of their own insignificance. The younger guard shifted, tapping the toe of his boot against the stone. The other pulled out his phone, scrolling aimlessly, not reading, not focused, just hiding his nerves behind a glowing screen. Dorian saw it all. Not just their movements. He saw through them. Saw the smallness behind their false confidence. And they didn't know it, but in this moment, they were being observed far more than they were observing him. He turned his gaze back to the gate. The iron bars stood tall and cold, a monument to privilege. Privilege he'd bought. Privilege he'd bled for. And yet here he was, its owner, still being treated like a beggar knocking to be let in. His mother's voice came back to him, clear as if she were sitting beside him. You'll knock on doors you already own, Dorian, and sometimes they'll still pretend they don't know who you are. As a boy, he hadn't understood. Now he understood too well. Every wall, every gate, every look. They weren't built for protection. They were built for control. Control over people like him. He closed his eyes and drew in a long breath, not to calm himself, but to remind himself he was still in command of everything that mattered. Sometimes, victory is not in the shouting, it's in the quiet. In letting the truth do the work for you. A cold gust swept through, carrying the damp smell of grass and the rustle of leaves. And then, faint at first, a sound the low, steady growl of an engine. Not close, but coming. Dorian opened his eyes, the corner of his mouth lifting ever so slightly. 8 minutes were nearly up, and with them, this little play was about to change acts. By the 7th minute, tension hung heavy over the cobblestone like a storm about to break. Dorian stayed silent, staring at the gate like it was the only thing in the world worth seeing. The younger guard finally cracked, forcing out a crooked smile. "Your friends won't get through either," he said, voice carrying that mix of mockery and discomfort. Dorian turned his head, slowly, and fixed his gaze on him. No frown, no flash of anger. Just an unblinking stare sharp enough to freeze the night air. Then he leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the wheel, like a patient audience member watching a play reach its final, inevitable scene. "Oh," he said, voice smooth, almost conversational. "Interesting. I'll remember that." That was all. No threats, no raised voice. But that calm, deliberate tone sent a chill up both their spines. Some men scream to be heard. Others speak softly, and you just know something bad is coming. Dorian was the latter. The guard glanced at his partner, looking for some kind of reassurance, but found none. Confidence was cracking. Because when a man like that doesn't act the way you expect, it means you've stepped into a game you don't know how to play. And then, the sound grew louder. A low, commanding hum of an engine approaching. A pair of headlights cut through the night, washing the gate in blinding white. Dorian closed his eyes briefly, leaning back against the seat. He knew. This was the moment. And in just a few breaths, this little play of theirs would have a new lead actor. And it wouldn't be them. That sound wasn't just a car approaching. It was the sound of reality coming for them. And it would crush their fragile arrogance without raising its voice. The sound came first as a low growl, rumbling through the rows of trees lining the street, then grew into the heavy, deliberate roar of an engine slicing through the cold, damp air. It was as if the entire neighborhood flinched awake. The two guards spun around, squinting against the blinding headlights of a black SUV pulling up to the gate. It stopped a few yards from where Dorian sat. The headlights shut off, leaving only the soft, yellow glow of the overhead street lamp washing over its polished surface like a mirror. The door opened. A man stepped out, dark-tailored suit, shoes that hit the cobblestone with the weight of someone who knew exactly where he was and why he was there. No introductions, no rush, but every step sounded like a stamp of authority. The guards instinctively straightened, scrambling to recapture some of the professionalism they'd lost in the past few minutes. "Who are you?" one asked, his voice trembling just enough to betray the false front. The man didn't answer immediately. He walked straight to Dorian's car, leaned slightly toward the open window, and said just loud enough for him to hear, "Mr. Hayes." Dorian opened his eyes. A slow smile crept across his face. "Right on time." The brief exchange sent the guards into silent confusion. They glanced at each other, unsure what to do next. The man in the suit turned toward them, his eyes cold as a frozen lake. "This is the owner of this estate," he said, each word hitting like a hammer. "And you've been blocking him from entering his own home." Silence swallowed everything. The guards froze, their faces stretching tight as the reality set in. Every excuse, every smug little rule they thought they were enforcing, dissolved into nothing. They weren't looking at a stranger anymore. They were looking at their employer, and realizing they'd made the one mistake people in their position can never make. Dorian didn't move. He didn't step out. He let them sit in that truth. This wasn't an introduction, this was a lesson. And it was one he intended for them to learn slowly through the suffocating awareness of standing before a man they'd insulted, who now held the power to decide their fate. And what they didn't know, this SUV was only the opening act. The real power hadn't arrived yet. The opposite door of the SUV opened. This time, another man stepped out. Not cold and distant like the first, but crisp and polished company security uniform pressed to a razor's edge, nameplate gleaming, shoes shining so bright they caught the street lamp above. He walked quickly to Dorian's car, no hesitation in his stride. When he was just a few feet away, he bowed deeply. "Mr. Hayes," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried. It was impossible not to hear. The two guards felt their stomachs drop. They looked at each other, then at Dorian, then at the man bowing before him. That single word Mr. ripped apart the illusion they'd been clinging to. The man they'd tossed IDs back at, the man they'd mocked like some out-of-place outsider, was being addressed the way only the most powerful clients were addressed. Dorian slowly opened his door. No rush. But every motion pulled their eyes to him. He stepped out, his dark overcoat falling into place as he stood tall under the street lamp, commanding the space without effort. He didn't look at the guards. His gaze was fixed on the manager, as if they were the only two people in existence. "Right on time," Dorian said, his voice low and even. The manager nodded, beads of sweat forming at his temple despite the night chill. "My apologies, Mr. Hayes. This is entirely my responsibility. It won't happen again." The words sliced through the last thread of tension. The guards understood too late that the situation had gone far beyond their control. They weren't gatekeepers anymore. They were defendants awaiting judgment. Dorian scanned the area, his gaze finally settling on the two pale-faced guards. He said nothing. Not a word of scolding, not a barked command. But his silence felt like a verdict. He let them drown in it, the shame of having their tiny illusion of authority ripped from them in front of the man who owned everything they thought they were protecting. "Take me in," Dorian said at last, his voice cutting through the stillness like an executioner's blade. The manager nodded sharply, signaling for the gate to be opened. The guards moved slowly, every action heavy with the humiliation of men walking toward their own gallows. But they didn't know yet this wasn't the end of their disgrace. Dorian hadn't even started. The iron gate groaned as it swung open, the sound like a confession dragged out of unwilling lips. Dorian didn't step forward right away. He waited until they had to bow their heads as he passed, like condemned men awaiting a sentence they knew was coming. When the engines quieted and the night swallowed the noise, his voice came soft, measured, but heavy as stone. "It seems," Dorian paused, letting his eyes sweep across them, "you don't know who you work for." The words stripped away their uniforms, leaving them naked before real power. No yelling, no threats. Just a man calmly reading the weather while destroying their dignity. One opened his mouth to speak but found nothing. The other lowered his gaze, hands trembling as if he no longer knew what to do with them. They were used to being the ones holding the keys deciding who passed, who stayed out. Now they knew they'd never owned those keys. Dorian said nothing more. He turned, walking through the gate with the manager a few paces behind him, silent like a servant. Each step he took buried them deeper in the pit they'd dug for themselves. He didn't need to announce their punishment. He knew this quiet humiliation would cling to them longer than any shouted reprimand. He stopped once, turning back to them. "Next time," he said, his voice as cold as the night air. "Remember who this neighborhood belongs to." The manager inhaled sharply, as if he wanted to say something to soften the blow, but Dorian's gaze silenced him. Nothing more needed to be said. The two guards stood there, suddenly small in their own skins, feeling the weight of what had just been taken from them, not just their pride, but the illusion of power they thought they had. But what they didn't know, this was just the prelude. Dorian still had one card left to play, and when he revealed it, the whole system would bow. The security manager kept a respectful distance after leading Dorian a few steps inside, then stopped. He took a deep breath, like a man about to speak words that would silence everyone. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice firm but tinged with unease. "I've already notified upper management, and I think the team here needs a reminder of something important. You are the largest shareholder of our company." The words fell like a stone. The two guards froze where they stood. One blinked rapidly, as if praying he'd misheard. The other stood rigid, his hands unconsciously clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. In an instant, every ounce of imagined authority they thought they held evaporated. They hadn't just stopped a resident. They had insulted the man who controlled their livelihoods, the man who, with a single signature, could bring down the entire system they leaned on. Dorian turned, looking at them not with anger, but with the cold detachment of a professor watching two students fail the easiest question on the exam. He didn't need to say, "Do you know who I am?" The manager had said it for him. And the silence that followed was the lesson. He stepped closer, just enough for the weight of his words to settle on their shoulders. "Interesting," he said slowly. "The men hired to protect me, stopped me from entering my own home, and worse, they work for me." The words weren't loud, but they transformed the courtyard into a suffocating box. The security manager lowered his head further, as if wishing to erase himself from the scene. He knew the truth when a shareholder like Dorian appeared. The usual hierarchy didn't matter, and those two guards, they weren't anyone anymore. Dorian chuckled softly. It wasn't a pleasant laugh. It was the bitter laugh of a man who understood the game too well. He wasn't just looking at two foolish guards. He was staring at the system that had created them, a system designed to disrespect those who looked different, even when those people held the reins. "It seems," he continued, his eyes sweeping across them, "we need to redefine what the word owner means." But they didn't know yet this wasn't his ending. Dorian still had one more card to play, and when he did, they'd understand what real power looked like. Dorian stood still, letting the heavy silence settle. The manager's words weren't news to him. He knew every share he owned, every contract this company owed its existence to. But what struck him wasn't the reminder of his power. It was the bitter irony of it all. He was the largest shareholder of this security company. On paper, they worked for him. In reality, just minutes ago, the men now staring at the ground had treated him like an intruder. Dorian drew a deep, slow breath. In that moment, he realized that every gate he'd ever passed, whether leaving a slum or entering a boardroom, had never truly been opened for him. They'd been cracked just enough to see if he could knock the right way, dress the right way, speak the right way, and even when he did, there was always someone like these two guards tonight willing to stand in his way and say, "You don't belong here." He remembered those early board meetings, the limp handshakes, the scrutinizing eyes over his freshly tailored suit. Dorian understood he had bought his seat at the table, but he had never been given their recognition. And tonight, standing at the gate of a house he owned, he felt it again, that gnawing sense of being a guest in a world he had paid to enter. He glanced down at his shoes, polished, expensive, but they did nothing to erase the skin above them. This system, he thought, is built to make people like me repeat over and over who we are. Even when we own it, we still have to stand at the gate, waiting for permission to enter. The corner of his mouth curved upward in a half-smile, half-sneer. It wasn't aimed at the trembling guards, it was aimed at the machine that made them. A machine clever enough to feed them false authority, yet ruthless enough to crush them the moment real power arrived. Dorian lifted his head and locked eyes with the manager. "We're going to fix a lot of things," he said slowly, starting with teaching them who they actually work for. But he knew words alone would never fix a system. This would require a lesson, and he was about to deliver it in a way they'd never forget. Dorian stayed still, letting the silence do what harsh words couldn't strip this moment bare. The two guards kept their heads bowed, like statues nailed to the cold stone ground. Even the manager stayed silent, knowing anything he said would only make it worse. Finally, Dorian spoke. His voice was soft, almost casual, but each word cut like a blade through the night air. "Fascinating." He paused, letting the two syllables sink into them. Then he tilted his head, fixing the guards with a smile that was neither kind nor cruel, just sharp enough to draw blood. "You've just insulted your own employer." The words dropped like a verdict, not shouted, not embellished, but final. One guard opened his mouth to apologize, but no sound came out. The other stepped back half a pace, as if distance could shield him from the shame wrapping around his throat. But Dorian wasn't looking at them anymore. He turned to the manager, his gaze cutting like glass. "Remember this," he said, "not for my apology, but to understand that the system you run taught them to see me as an outsider, even when I own it." The manager swallowed hard and bowed deeper. He knew this wasn't just a reminder, it was a warning. Dorian turned toward his house, but before he left, he stopped. Without looking back, he delivered his last line soft as a breath, heavy as a sentence. "Think carefully about who truly holds the keys to these gates." No one replied, no one dared. He walked on, each step echoing against the stone path like the tolling of a bell hammering against a machine programmed wrong from the beginning. A machine that no longer owned him. Because now, Dorian wasn't just surviving it. He was the one rewiring it. And he still had one last move left, one that would make sure the system remembered his name forever. The security manager hurried a few steps ahead, but stopped at what he deemed a safe distance from Dorian. The yellow gate light illuminated every bead of sweat rolling down his temple, exposing the unease his neatly pressed uniform couldn't conceal. "Mr. Hayes, please." His voice faltered, swallowed halfway between fear and remorse. He wanted to say more, but the words seemed lodged in his throat. Dorian stood still, turning slightly to fully face him. He said nothing, made no unnecessary movements. His silence was a tightening rope, forcing the man across from him to wrestle with his own discomfort. The night grew still, only the hum of insects and the pounding hearts of those who knew they had crossed a line remained. "This was our fault," the manager finally blurted, bowing his head as if the gesture could erase what had happened. "We'll take care of this immediately." Dorian raised an eyebrow, a flicker of irony in his gaze. "Take care of it?" he repeated, his voice calm and low, as though he was weighing the meaning of the words. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "No, not take care of it, now." The two guards stiffened, frozen in place. One parted his lips as if to speak, but Dorian turned toward him, and a single glance was enough to silence him. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. The men before him already understood they had crossed the final boundary. The manager swallowed hard, trying to keep his voice steady. "You want me to fire them?" Dorian's tone was almost casual, like he was requesting a menu change. Right here, right now. Another heavy silence followed. Then the manager turned and gestured for the two guards to leave their posts. They walked away slowly, shoulders slumped, not daring to look back, no excuses, no pleas for forgiveness. Dorian watched them go, not with satisfaction, not with anger, simply with the look of a man who had just cleared 2 pebbles from his path. But what he was about to do next would be the real lesson not just for them, but for the system that created them. Dorian slipped a hand into his coat pocket and pulled out a pen as the manager hurriedly produced a paper. It was a pre-drafted termination order, waiting only for his signature. The yellow light above cast a stark glow on the page as Dorian slowly signed his name. No one dared breathe too loudly. No sound interrupted the quiet scratch of pen on paper. When he finished, he folded the document and handed it back without so much as a glance. A simple action, but heavier than any shouted reprimand. The night grew colder, though not from the breeze. This was the cold of power, executed in silence. The two guards stood off to the side, faces pale. They looked at each other like men walking to the gallows. Once confident in their uniforms, they were now stripped of every illusion. The gate's light stretched their shadows across the stone pavement, distorting them into broken shapes. No trace remained of the swagger they'd worn while stopping a man who owned more than they could fathom. Dorian didn't look at them again. He left them in that silence, to sit with their shame, a shame that needed no words. True power doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be present, casting a shadow long enough to force others to confront themselves. The manager stood frozen, sweating despite the chill in the air. He bowed deeper as he received the folded paper from Dorian, like a man accepting a sentence on behalf of an entire system. He knew this wasn't just a firing. This was a declaration this man wasn't just a shareholder. He was someone who could decide who stayed here and who would be cast out. Dorian walked toward the steps leading up to his house. He stopped, once again letting silence speak for him. Then, without turning back, his voice cut through the night, low but sharp. "These gates are not here to judge who belongs. They open when I decide they open." No one replied, no one dared. But Dorian wasn't finished. He still had one last message, something that would turn this night into a lesson they would carry for the rest of their lives. Standing on the steps, one hand resting lightly on the cold iron railing, Dorian let the light etch his sharp features into something almost statuesque. He didn't turn immediately. Instead, he let the silence stretch, letting the faint hum of crickets and the ragged breaths of those behind him fill the space. Tonight, silence was his sharpest weapon, one that choked excuses in their throats. Finally, he spoke. No raised voice, no dramatic flourish. Yet every word hit like a stone thrown into still water, shattering the surface. "If you cannot recognize the owner," he paused, letting the words hang heavy, "then you cannot protect anything." The manager bowed lower, as if forced to confront his own reflection in those words. The two guards stood like forgotten statues, every fiber of their bodies trembling. This wasn't just a reprimand. It was an indictment against them, against the system that hired them, against the mindset that turned these gates into tools of judgment instead of protection. Dorian took another step up, turned his head, and looked directly at the manager. A faint, cold smile touched his lips, not one of joy, but of a man proving an undeniable truth. "Tonight," he said, his tone still even, "you didn't just fail at your job. You failed to understand who this place belongs to." The words carried no anger, but their weight was crushing. This was true power, the kind that doesn't shout, but makes others bow under its gravity. He turned and walked slowly toward the main door. The manager started to speak, but stopped himself. He knew no words could undo this night. Dorian didn't look back. He knew they stood there, drowning in the positions they thought gave them authority, and he let them sit with the truth. Power isn't in standing at the gate. Power is being the one who decides why the gate exists at all. He placed his hand on the door handle but paused. "Tomorrow," he said, still without turning, "I want a full report on how you're going to fix this, so it never happens again." No one replied, only the manager's deeper bow served as an answer. But Dorian knew this wasn't the end. The final blow was still to come, one that wouldn't just hit a few guards. It would hit the entire system that made him knock on his own door. The lights in the surrounding mansions began to flicker on, a few windows cracking open. The once quiet night now held shifting silhouettes behind curtains. In this neighborhood, news traveled faster than the wind. No one had to speak. The wealthy neighbors already knew there had been trouble at the gates. Now they were silently watching. A blonde woman in a silk robe peeked through a second-floor window, phone glowing in her hand as if she were ready to call someone. Across the street, a middle-aged man stood in the shadows, cradling a glass of whiskey, his eyes locked on the scene below. Their gazes shared the same traits: curiosity, caution, and that familiar, measuring look of people who believe they know who belongs here. But when the gates opened and the security manager bowed to Dorian, they began to understand the truth. The man the guards had treated like an intruder wasn't just a resident. He was the true owner of that home, and more than that, someone powerful enough to make the entire neighborhood's security apparatus bow its head. Another window lit up, and a hushed voice drifted out, tinged with disbelief. "It's him. Hayes." The name passed like a whisper of confirmation and a reminder. Real power often moves quietly until it forces you to look. Dorian stood on the stone steps, his back to the uninvited audience staring at his every move. He knew they were watching. In fact, he wanted them to. Some lessons aren't meant only for foolish guards. They're for an entire neighborhood that once silently wondered, does he really belong here? He turned, sweeping his gaze across a few glowing windows. It only took a moment, but it was enough. Curtains snapped shut. Figures retreated into the safety of their homes, as if caught in an act they shouldn't have been performing. Dorian allowed himself a thin smile. It was the smile of a man who understood the game just minutes ago. They saw him as humiliated. Now, with one bow from the head of security, every one of those gazes had shifted. But he wasn't done. Not yet. There was still one move left, one that would turn this night into a lesson impossible for even those hiding behind their curtains to forget. Dorian stayed on the steps, his back still to the unseen audience behind those glowing windows. The night was so still he could hear the wind moving through the trees and the faint chime of a wind bell from a nearby balcony. In that quiet, an old memory rose so clear it felt as if his mother were standing right beside him. Even when you build the house, they'll still think you don't belong in it. It was a humid summer afternoon. Years ago, he was a young man then, freshly employed at a company his old neighborhood saw as an untouchable tower. His mother sat at their worn, wooden kitchen table, calloused hands gripping his, speaking with a voice that was part warning, part comfort. Dorian had laughed then, thinking she was exaggerating. But now, standing on the steps of a home he'd paid more than anyone here to own, her words echoed like prophecy. He had climbed every rung of the social ladder, sacrificing health and youth to enter spaces deemed exclusive. Yet even at the peak, the shadow of doubt clung to him. Tonight, under the prying eyes of his wealthy neighbors, he felt it more sharply than ever, a system clever enough to let him in, but never enough to let him forget he once stood outside. Dorian took a deep breath, his gaze lifting toward the lit windows. They said nothing, but he knew their thoughts, and he knew the best response wasn't a speech, nor an argument. It was his presence calm, unshaken, unapologetic. He let the silence stretch, sending a wordless message, "I belong here. Whether you like it or not, that will not change." A faint, bittersweet smile crossed his face. His mother's words were no longer a warning. They were a reminder of the power of standing firm, even when the world wants to push you back. But Dorian wasn't finished. He had one last gesture, a silent declaration that would make everyone in this neighborhood remember him every time they walked through these gates. He stood there on the cold stone steps, as if the entire world had shrunk to this yard and the glowing windows across the street. He knew the neighbors were still watching. Some pretended to close their curtains, but their hands froze midway, leaving narrow slits just wide enough to keep staring. Their curiosity was familiar to him, a blend of judgment and the quiet fear that true power inspires when it shows itself. Dorian turned his head and looked directly at one lit window, where a woman stood hiding behind a curtain. In that moment, he did something that froze every watcher behind those panes of glass. He raised his hand and gently waved. Not a proud wave, not a bitter one, a polite, almost gracious nod, like a guest bidding farewell to a host after a dinner party. And that's what made it sting. That simple gesture flipped the roles completely. He wasn't the one trying to prove he belonged. They were the ones hiding, too afraid to stand tall and face the truth about who he was. The irony in that wave was sharper than any words. It said, "You saw me as an outsider, but I don't need to prove anything. I stand here, on my own steps, still gracious enough to greet you." Several curtains snapped shut immediately. Others remained half open, but the way they looked at him had changed. Gone was the quiet contempt of people who believed themselves above him. What remained was something far more human: embarrassment, mixed with an uneasy respect. Dorian lowered his hand, turned his back, and walked inside. The heavy wooden door closed behind him with a clean, final thud, punctuating the night and ending their voyeurism. He knew they would talk about how a major shareholder had been stopped outside his own home, about how he stood there, silent, transforming humiliation into a lesson for the entire neighborhood. And most of all, about that final wave, a small gesture powerful enough to force those behind the curtains to reflect on themselves. But the night wasn't over, not yet. There was still one more quiet moment left, a moment for Dorian to face himself, not as a man being judged, but as one rewriting the rules. Dorian pushed the heavy wooden door open, its hinges groaning in a low, deep tone, and stepped inside. The warm scent of oak and the faint citrus from the diffuser instantly replaced the biting chill of the night air. He paused on the entryway rug, turned slightly, and closed the door behind him. The sharp click echoed an unmistakable full stop to the chaos left outside. In the vast silence of the house, only the sound of his shoes struck the marble floor, each step like a metronome, reminding him that he was still here, the rightful owner of this home. No apologies followed him in, no frantic explanations, just the quiet of high walls. The kind of quiet that belonged to a man too used to battles where victory came without cheers. He placed his keys on the console table by the door, then leaned against the bench in the entry hall. Tonight's victory didn't feel like the others. It wasn't like signing a massive deal or outmaneuvering a rival. There was no thrill, no satisfaction, just a hollow weight, as if he'd merely corrected a mistake that should never have existed in the first place. Closing his eyes, Dorian replayed the scene at the gate, two young guards, so sure of their borrowed authority, daring to block him at the entrance to his own home. The security manager bowing his head, too afraid to breathe. The neighbors, those shadowy figures behind their curtains, watching him as though they were watching a performance. He had reversed it all, forced them to see him differently. Yet the triumph felt heavy, Tonight, he understood an old truth with a new sting. No house is large enough to make a man like him naturally belong. The gates could swing open, but there would always be hands ready to slam them shut in his face regardless of what he paid to be inside. His eyes opened and settled on the massive painting above the wall, a tranquil scene he once thought represented the peace he'd earned by building this life. Now, it was nothing more than a bitter reflection, pieces never given. It must be claimed, over and over, even when you've already paid for it. Dorian knew tonight couldn't end as just another lesson learned. It would be the start of something bigger, something that ensured those gates would never dare to close on him again. He sat on the long bench in the foyer, fingers interlocked, staring at the intricate Persian rug beneath his feet. It was the piece he'd chosen most carefully when decorating this house, believing it would give him a sense of belonging. Yet tonight, even it couldn't make him feel at home. He had won by others' standards. He'd made the guards bow their heads, reclaimed respect he should never have had to demand. But why did this victory feel so heavy? It wasn't satisfaction, it wasn't vindication, it was exhaustion. Even when you build the house, they'll still think you don't belong in it. His mother's voice returned steady, patient, as if she knew he'd one day need her words to face himself. In his youth, he thought her too cynical, that if he worked hard enough, climbed high enough, the walls would welcome him as someone worthy. But now he knew those walls weren't built to welcome him. They were built to remind him and people like him that this was never your world. He leaned his head back, staring at the vaulted ceiling. He had paid for every brick in this mansion. He had bought his presence in spaces his neighbors took for granted. And yet, tonight, at the gate of his own home, he was still forced to prove he had the right to stand there. A quiet laugh slipped from his throat, not of joy, but of irony. This game, he realized, had never been one he could truly win. This system, Dorian thought, was never designed for him to belong. It only allowed him inside as long as he accepted that he'd remain an outsider. And that realization, bitter as it was, didn't weaken him. It sharpened his resolve. Because if the system wasn't built for him to belong, then it was time to redesign it. Dorian stood, walking slowly down the hallway to his study. Each footstep on the stone floor echoed like a reminder that there was still work to do. He switched on the light, flooding the room with a warm glow that washed over the towering bookshelves, the abstract painting behind his desk, and the leather chair where he'd made decisions that shaped entire companies. Tonight would be no different. He opened his laptop, logged into the shareholder management system. His hands moved deliberately, but without hesitation. This wasn't just about signing off on 2 terminations. He drafted a request for an emergency meeting with the board of the security firm, the firm where he was the largest shareholder. Not tomorrow. At first light. They would listen, and not just to apologize. A faint smile touched his lips, not the smile of revenge, but of a man who understood the rules of the game and was ready to rewrite them. He couldn't silence every judgmental glance or snide remark. But he could dismantle the system that created people bold enough to judge him at the entrance of his own home. He recalled the neighbors behind their curtains, the way their furtive stares shifted from disdain to unease when the manager bowed. They would talk about tonight, embellish it to suit their dinner table narratives. But Dorian didn't need them to get it right. He only needed them to remember. Tonight wasn't about teaching a pair of foolish guards a lesson. It was about forcing everyone who saw him as an outsider to realize they were wrong. He closed the laptop, stood, and faced the tall window overlooking his garden. In the darkness, it was just him and himself, no audience, no bowed heads. "Power doesn't need to shout," he murmured, almost as if reminding himself. "It only needs to let the guilty reveal themselves." He turned off the light, leaving the study in darkness, and stepped back into the softly lit hallway. Tonight was over, but its shockwaves for the security firm, for this neighborhood, and for Dorian himself were only beginning. And Dorian knew when the sun rose, no one would ever dare question whether he belonged here again. If this story touched your heart, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. Every click helps us bring more powerful stories of empathy, justice, and silent strength to life. Your support is what fuels this journey. Let's keep standing together and rising higher, one story at a time. Stay safe and inspired.